200 years ago, Jane Austen was probably standing somewhere around here. It might have been a similar day in November, chilly. But why was she here? Because she'd been invited to visit Carlton House.
Carlton House was very much the palace of the Prince Regent. It was in West London, and it was situated between the two parallel roads of Pall Mall, which leads down to St James's Palace, and the Mall, which is now the grand ceremonial approach to Buckingham Palace. This picture from the early 1800s shows the front of Carlton House looking out onto Pall Mall. In fact, you can barely see Carlton House. It's hidden behind a row of pillars that ran along the street of Pall Mall. This is the scene today from a very similar spot.
The grand entrance with its row of pillars was facing the Pall Mall that way, and behind me would be right over there the house and then the gardens which led on to the Mall.
When Jane Austen visited Carlton House in November 1815, there had already been a house on this spot for well over 100 years. An earlier house had been rebuilt in the very early 1700s, and in 1732 the then Prince of Wales, Frederick, son of George II, bought the house. But it was George, son of King George III, who was also Prince of Wales and would become Prince Regent and later on George IV, who really put Carlton House on the map.
He was given it on his coming of age, and he spent a fortune on it, decorating, redecorating it. It was the hub of polite society. He lived here during his regency, but when he became king, he went off it. He decided he needed something grander and tore it down and moved loads of stuff over to Buckingham Palace.
In 1785, Horace Walpole visited Carlton House while it was still being developed to the Prince of Wales' taste. He wrote, "We went to see the Prince's new palace in Pall Mall and were charmed. It will be the most perfect in Europe. There is an august simplicity that astonished me. You cannot call it magnificent. It is the taste and propriety that strike." Another visitor to the house wrote that the great hall had an air of classical elegance. But the air was soon to be filled with the dust of demolition. In the 1820s, George, now King George IV, gave permission for Carlton House to be knocked down. In its place went up the elegant residences of Carlton House Terrace and Carlton Gardens.
We're standing on the Mall just beside me here, and that leads up to Buckingham Palace. On this side of me is Carlton Terrace, and as far as we can work out from old maps, this was built on the gardens of Carlton House after it was demolished.
This column was also put up in the 1830s. It's topped with a statue of the Duke of York, brother of George IV. It stands on Carlton House Terrace. A short distance away at the other end of the Mall was the Queen's House, or Buckingham House. George IV transformed this house into a palace.
Behind me is Buckingham Palace, the palace that George IV made his very own. And a lot of the fittings and furniture from Carlton House ended up here.
This is the site of Carlton House today, Waterloo Place, off Pall Mall, with Waterloo Gardens on either side, and all surrounded by elegant Georgian houses. It all looks very different to when Jane Austen visited here in November 1815.
Of course, I don't know really what Jane thought of her visit, because she didn't like the Prince Regent, but it wasn't the sort of invitation she could turn down.